Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar, what is really going on with heat stress on farm. I'm Izzy Long, I'm the Animal Welfare Analyst at Galebreaker, and I'm going to be hosting today. So I'm going to hand over to Mark shortly, who's going to go over the signs and consequences of heat stress in cattle. And then I'll pass over to Andrew, who is going to go into a bit more depth about cow behaviour data and how we can improve the housed environment for cattle. But quickly, I'll just go over some housekeeping. So everyone's microphones will automatically be muted, but we would really like to hear everyone's questions. So if you could please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. And then at the end, we'll have a designated time to answer them. So just type them in there throughout the webinar, and I can read them up to the guys. And then if you're also joining from outside the UK, there are captions and subtitles available in that bottom bar as well in your chosen language, so make sure you turn those on. Let me hand over to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Izzy. And thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon. Appreciate your time and effort to join the webinar. It is being recorded, so you can watch it back. But appreciate everybody's always busy, so taking the time out of your days to come and listen is much appreciated. A quick introduction about myself. I'm Mark Scott. I'm the Dairy Area Representative for the UK and Ireland for Phibro Animal Health. So in my presentation, as you can see, I'm going to talk signs and consequences of heat stress. And the reality of on-farm experiences using some of my experience and observations, and hopefully be able to point you all in the direction of what we can be looking for in terms of signs, but also the consequences, which are a little bit longer lasting. Before I move on to a bit more of an introduction, just this first slide, I always enjoy this because as far as I'm concerned, cows never lie. So the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that the cows have cleared the TMR from the shaded area and have left the TMR in sunshine. Yes, that is probably going to heat up as well, given the sunshine, but no, cows are not too keen on being in direct sunlight. They'll tell you through their behaviours what they're feeling, and Andy touch on this a little bit later on as well, for sure. So a little bit of introduction overview about me and what we'll do. So I'm 25 years in the dairy industry, grew up on a dairy farm, 17 years advising on farms across the UK, but also travels around the world, New Zealand, Central America, throughout Europe. I've been working specifically on heat stress in the UK really for the past 4 summers. This is the 5th summer of really getting into it. And the reason for doing that was to explode a few myths about heat stress and to try to bring it to life for farmers and for advisors. So moving down to the agenda here, what I'll cover today is THI and heat stress, some introductions into signs of heat stress, the consequences of heat stress, and then also, as we say in English, there's no such thing as a free lunch, so how Phibro can help as well. So a little bit about Phibro. Phibro is a global animal health business. We're present in 75 countries across the world, and probably 60% of our business is in the US, 40% is in the rest of the world. We have several research centres in the US, but in Europe, where we are present, for those of you in Europe, we're present. I cover the UK and Ireland. Our European office is in Wavre in Belgium, and we have a vaccine plant which is all about monogastric animals. That's in Sligo, so that's our presence. And we have another location in Warsaw. So we're very lean on the ground in Europe, but yet we are here, we are present. But we have a very large animal health offering around the world, and we are one of the top 10 animal health businesses in the world. So yeah, to get into the subject of today, what is heat stress? I always start with this really to set the scene. THI, so temperature humidity index. It's the combination of both temperature and humidity, and I try to bring things to life on layman's terms. It's a bit like the real feel that you'll read on weather forecasts, and because it takes into account the effect of the humidity as to how, and especially for animals, how they can dissipate heat into the environment. And what's interesting is that cows experience heat stress from a THI of 68. Humans experience heat stress from a THI of 80. But what's really important there, those are big numbers, difference of 12, and that can look interesting. But I don't think anybody, even on this call, wakes up in the morning and goes, I wonder what the THI is going to be today. So again, I try to bring this to life. And from a UK perspective, we sit with summer humidities of between 50 and 60%. This has an impact on how we can try and cool our cows. But I always try to relay it into layman's terms. So the temperatures there are, cows will experience heat stress, and you'll see later on, sometimes even a little bit below that. But from THI of 68, which is 22 degrees Celsius, when humidity is around 55 to 60%, and humans at 31 degrees. So when you're sitting there enjoying the sunshine at 25 degrees, your cows are probably there suffering a little bit more, to say the least, because at 25 degrees, that's not comfortable for a cow at all. Also, add into this, it's understanding what's going on inside your barns. So I'll apologize to the UK audience. I'll keep using the word barns because most other people call them barns. We call them sheds, so it's interchangeable. So apologies. In the same way, sometimes we talk about cubicles and stalls. But in the barn, the reality of what's going on in the barn is somewhat different to what you might see from a weather station. So this is some data, real-time data, the blue line being data collected within barns in the UK, and the red lines being the local weather station to those same barns. So you can see that throughout the summer, I see the risk period for heat stress from a UK perspective from the start of May until the end of September. Probably for other European countries, this can extend, certainly it can be earlier than May, can be early April and into October, and probably sometimes the same in the UK. Certainly not at the moment in the UK, where it's some, like, let's call it fresh conditions. But this is data from June to September. You can see the difference on average is plus 2 points of THI within the barn or shed versus the local weather station. And that varies between 0 and +4. So some days we get a very similar reading, other days quite a difference. And I think it's really important that you understand what's going on in the barn. I think to emphasize that point, I was on a farm yesterday, and they had fans installed that were controlled automatically. And there was 3 barns. These were all within about 30, 40 meter range of each other. One barn was reading 16 degrees Celsius, second one 17, and the third one 18. So it is very different between barns. It's understanding what's going on inside and not outside. So don't get fooled by that, because there is a difference. So, but how does thermal stress affect cows? So I just wanted to touch on a few things we'll expand on a little bit more. But your cows of lower production will be able to withstand THI levels that are somewhat higher, mainly because of their metabolic heat production. So your higher yielding cows are more susceptible to lower THIs. And what we'll touch on a little bit more and expand on in the next slide is just how different that can be and why that is. And I think it's even more so as we move into even higher yielding cows, as we see much more frequently the averages in Europe of around that 40 kilos, 45 kilo average within a herd, never mind the days when we used to be at 30 to 35, maybe 15 years ago when I started my career. What's also interesting is that what is the thing we all talk about? What is the thing that every farmer is interested in? Every advisor will always ask the first thing, how are the cows milking? So milk production is affected at around THI 68, so a little bit lower than this graph shows, or this image shows. But what's important is that the one thing you can ask any farmer, when's it easier to get cows in calf? Is it in the winter or is it in the summer? Well, reproduction is impacted at a lower THI level than milk production. And what I want to emphasize with this is that we're talking about average THI for the day, not just when we pass a THI threshold during the day. That won't instantly impact reproduction or milk production. It's about averages for the day. To expand on that about the metabolic heat load of cows, and maybe our cows actually metabolically heat stressed, I could certainly argue that it certainly looks that way. When we first developed THI thresholds back in the 50s, the average cow, I think the cows on the study were only doing 12 kilos of milk, but the average was 10 kilos of milk and 16 megajoules of heat per day being produced. And when we revised that, we had a THI threshold there of 70. It was revised at the turn of the century, which sounds weird to say, but that was 2000, to be a THI of 68. But by that point, we had 3 times as much milk and 3 times as much body heat. Taking that into account, if you go into any herd, your own herd, if you're a farmer or if you're an advisor going onto a farm, if you've got a herd of cows, you'll be able to walk into a barn and see a cow. Probably there's a cow stood in front of you that's a 45 kilo a day cow, and there might be a 32 kilo a day cow stood somewhere near. There's a 26% difference in metabolic heat produced by those two cows. And I think that's really significant, and that's why it's so important that we're able to cool the cow, the inside out, as well as from the outside with mechanical cooling. And that's something we'll talk about as something unique about what we can do for you at Phibro, is cooling the cow from the inside out. So let's move on to some signs of heat stress. And these are things that you can walk into any barn, pretty much any given point in the day. And these things happen. These only need a threshold to be passed for a matter of hours during a day. It doesn't have to be an average for the day. So we know that from research, drinking behavior changes from THI 64. So that's around about 19 degrees Celsius when you're talking of a humidity of 55 to 60%. So it's not particularly warm, but drinking behavior changes by more visits to the drinker, longer time spent at the drinker, increased intakes, and also you get more displacement. So that is that the more dominant cows push the subservient cows out, and so they can actually change their drinking patterns. And there's obviously some proof of that as well if you watch cows. Now, just quickly, there's a little video here. It's observed on a farm in the north of England a few years ago. The THI at the time was 75, so it is quite warm, 27 degrees. But you notice the cows are stood with their heads over the water trough. The reason for that is that the air above the water is cooler than the air in the rest of the barn. So they're getting the benefit of the cooling, okay, so the cooler air. But the clever cow in the middle, or the mischievous cow, is splashing water onto the floor below her. So she's getting the benefit of the cooling by convection from below, from the cooler water on the floor. That's one thing to think about, and it's interesting to observe. But what problems does that cause? Well, it causes this problem. This is the wide shot of this same barn. So we think that dry matter intake can be impacted by rising THI. Well, also through cow flu. So these cows, not the best design of a barn, but there are many, many barns in the UK not designed, not built for keeping cows in the summer. We've changed to keeping cows in the summer more so in the last 10 years. More of the modern barns are completely different, but this shows that cow flow is massively impacted because these cows want to cool themselves down. Okay, so that's a knock-on effect. But signs, you can walk into any barn and start to observe drinking behavior and cows standing. And I observed this again last summer on a farm in Scotland. On a hot day, cows standing with their heads over the top. Moving on to the next sign and the next threshold is a THI of 67. So around, again, not that high, only 21.5 degrees Celsius, but this is behavior that cows will demonstrate. So standing and lying time changes. So more time spent standing, less time spent lying down. And that's because cows lose heat by convection. So standing up, more of their body surface is exposed to the air. So here you can observe the number of cows standing in the stalls and cows voluntary standing in the passageway. Interestingly, I think that what you can start doing, and I am doing it myself, is that you can create a little graph and demonstrate it to your farmers, and be a farmer yourself and count this. And you can go into a barn and go, actually, I get really good occupancy levels in the winter. But as the summer progresses, I have more and more cows standing in stalls instead of lying down. And then you can actually observe that they're telling you they're getting a little bit heat stressed. Observe here as well, there is a fan. It's very dirty. It's not going to have the same effect. It probably could do with being angled down a bit more. But this is very typical, realistic commercial farm. The second part of this picture is actually to the right-hand side here. It's the second part of the barn. Again, like I said, built a long time ago, not really for the summer. But cows are telling you a story. Don't want to lie in these stalls. The airflow is poor. It's probably very warm. The roof is very low. Over here, yes, they will use those stalls if they have to, but 50% of them are standing up. And actually, they're almost underneath a greenhouse effect because of the skylights. And it's something that we shouldn't underestimate the skylights. So imagine there's not a lot of air here and there's skylights. It's going to be very warm in this area. So again, cows don't lie to you. So that's a sign to be able to walk into a shed and a barn and see drinking behavior or cows standing. The knock-on effect of the standing and lying times is really well demonstrated by Nigel Cook. So unpublished data, but over a 5-year period, it's unpublished, but it has been presented, that THI is the black and claw lesions in red. And there's a 2-month lag between the peak in THI and the peak in claw lesions. And you can see it's over for 5 years he's demonstrating this. And so when you see your peak temperatures in July and August, you see more claw lesions in September, October, and maybe on into November as well, from a UK and Western Europe perspective. And that's something that is the knock-on effect of why lying and standing times are really important. So again, we want to try and cool these cows internally and externally to encourage them to lie down. The final one on signs, on things that you can walk into a barn and see, are respiration rates. So make your way to our website. We have a respiration rate guide that you could download and understand how to measure this and what the results are telling you. But we don't see heat stress when we're at less than 68 on the THI. You should be seeing 40 to 60 breaths per minute. Time the cow's breathing for 15 seconds, then multiply by 4, and you'll get the nice number. If you want to look at body temperature, you can, and the best time to do that is probably the following in the morning. It's probably between 7 and 9 a.m. because if a cow's still got an elevated temperature but she's not sick, it's because she hasn't cooled down from the day before. We don't see that so often in the UK, but it's a tip you can use. Just on respiration rates, you would expect mild heat stress when THI gets to 68 to 71, and so respiration rates increase. And you can see that for yourself. And again, another little video. This is also this is a THI of 75 in July 2021. Just observe the cow and the breathing. So there's two things about a cow breathing that quickly. It's not comfortable, and two, she can't ruminate. No, she's not ruminating while she's breathing that quickly. She just can't physically do it. So if you actually counted those respiration rates, this cow, despite being a THI 75, so she should be in the mild to moderate, breathing at 75 to 85 breaths per minute. She's actually doing 120 breaths per minute. So who's right and who's wrong? She's not lying. She's experiencing this heat stress. Ambient THI is here, but she is feeling it differently because of her production level, more than likely. But again, something you can walk into a barn and instantly assess 10 cows in the barn and say, are they showing me signs of heat stress? And we have a guide for that on our website. And it's something that I'm doing on a regular basis and building up a picture for farmers, because sometimes these changes are very gradual and you don't always notice it. So it becomes normalized, so to speak. So it's a good way to be able to pick up on it. But moving on to consequences. So consequences of heat stress are things when we have a daily average THI, so not a 1 hour or 2 hour period, but a daily average THI. And there are two areas to concentrate on: really conception and fertility, and milk yield and milk quality. So we'll look at conception rates, because actually estrus detection starts to decline when the average daily THI exceeds 57, which is about 14 degrees. But by having automated heat detection systems, we kind of negate some of that, because basically what those cows start doing until it gets very hot, they basically have shorter estrus activity and move it to the cooler parts of the day. So it's actually a little bit later for overnight. If you don't do automated heat detection, you'll miss it. But this is about conception rates, and these start changing when the daily average THI exceeds 65, which is about 20 degrees Celsius. So you need a daily average of 24-hour period at 20 degrees Celsius. This is a farm in Scotland. So this isn't even northern England. This is Scotland, renowned for not being very warm and not being very sunny. But this is real terms. So this is a farm doing a very good job. Conception rates in blue are running at around 50%. But you'll see the THI now. This is weekly THI average and weekly average conception rate. So it's not like day by day, but it gives you a very good impression. You can see running around nice 50%. Suddenly we get a THI of 64 average for the week. So you've probably got a few days in there that were 65 and higher. And we see a drop from 54% effectively to 14%. Huge. Then you've got THI 65 for the week, 66, and so on. You can see there's a really clear pattern how the conception rates are depressed when THI daily averages are at 65 and more. And then it reverses because it cools down and it goes back up. It's a really clear sign. And what's interesting is that you see that not just on the day of the THI event, so today's daily average THI is 65, that can affect cows that were inseminated up to 3 weeks earlier and 3 weeks later. And that's down to 3 weeks earlier can be because you can get actual embryo damage and early embryo loss. And you can also get a restriction because blood flow goes to the skin because of heat, so that there's less nutrients and hormones, and so we can't recognize the pregnancy. For those that may not conceive as well for the 3 weeks after the heat event, it's because of oocyte quality, and that's can have a big impact. So again, it's a huge point. And again, if you can cool your cows internally as well as externally, or both, then great. That's what we should be trying to do. But that's a reality of a farm in Scotland. This is not in the hot spots. Now, what's interesting is that the difference in Scotland is that they build a barn to keep the weather out, not let the weather in, because it's windy and rainy and all the rest of it. So this barn in particular, a nice curtain side, but it's built with adjoining buildings, so you don't get the airflow through, so you have less natural ventilation, which Andrew will cover a little bit more on as well. But we're talking about what we can see. Now, this is data I was tracking and was able to look at, but not until November to track back and look at the whole of the summer. So a lot of this consequences can be seen after the event. Moving on to yield, we won't touch on milk quality because we don't have the time, but yield, daily average THI 68 is where you see the impact. So this is a graph of a farm in the Midlands of England. You can see the yield per cow in blue, and you can see the daily average THI in red. So these cows are high yielding. They're doing around about that 39 to 40 kilos. You can see here for the UK, we had what we call a heat wave, so elevated temperatures for over a week there in mid-late July 2021. And you can see the impact at most was a loss of 7 litres of milk. When it cooled down, the cows responded, and again, Andrew will cover some of this as to how cows change their behaviours and some of the intake characteristics, etc. But it takes them a while to get back to where they were, and actually probably takes them the best part of 3 weeks. It doesn't just instantly come back when you've had a long period of heat stress. And again, it bobbles along, and they've probably recovered because this is classic UK, very hot, then very normal for August. But then we have a heat event in early September, and we have a corresponding milk yield decline. So although milk yield is the one that we always talk about, it happens latest, and actually it normally happens, you don't need just one day of THI 68, but consecutive 2 to 3 days normally in my experience. Now I'm talking Northwest Europe, I'm not talking the Mediterranean, I'm not talking, we've got a lot of guests from Turkey, etc., in the Middle East, but you'll have completely different. But this is just an observation as to how we actually can see this, and we need to support. Now this farm has got fans in some sheds and not others. The previous slide, by the way, this guy didn't have any fans and fitted fans at the end of this summer, and then started feeding the feed out of the following one. So he's looked at the data and figured it all out. But to move on, we've covered signs, we've covered consequences. To move on to what can you do about it? How can Phibro help you? So at Phibro, we have an incredible product in our portfolio called Omnigen. So Omnigen is an immune modulator. It helps cows be healthy and stay healthy through expected and unexpected stress. Now, heat stress is an unexpected stress. You cannot predict when it's coming. But if we can cool our cows from the inside out, then great. Now, Omnigen has got a lot of research data, over 130 papers, I believe, and it's looking at udder health, so cell count and mastitis. Also fertility, it improves fertility through improved uterine health and also transition. But it's got an EU patent for the reduction of the impact of heat stress. And that's really important. It's something that you're not just being a rumen buffer or a yeast dealing with the consequences of heat stress with acidosis, but you're reducing the likelihood that cow can suffer as much heat stress. And how do we know that? The research we have, I've got 3 slides to show you that we have cows fed on Omnigen versus cows not fed Omnigen in a commercial dairy farm in Brazil. You can see that the average vaginal temperature of the cows on control was 39.1. The cows fed Omnigen, 38.85. That's a significant difference. And what's interesting is that the error bars, the hottest that the cows got on Omnigen was not as hot as the cows, or the average, the control cow's lowest point. What's interesting then is we also had a percentage of time, TH over 68, and temperature of the cow over 39.1. In the Omnigen-fed cows, that was reduced by 50%. So you went from 36, 37% of the time down to around 17% of the time, 18% of the time on the Omnigen-fed cows with a nice p-value. The knock-on effects was that we saw a significant impact of yield on this particular event. A second example of this would be this study. Now, this study is more of a controlled study with climate chambers. But when we exposed the cows to THI 68, we saw 2 kilos more dry matter intake, which would have knock-on effects to maintaining milk production or increasing. But what's interesting is rectal temperature. So we saw a reduced rectal temperature at 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Now, heat load in the barn normally peaks around, say, between 3 and 6 p.m. So it's interesting to see that looking at 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. So although we think it's hottest at midday, it's not. We have a build-up of heat in the barn. So we had a reduced rectal temperature, but also reduced respiration rates in the cows fed Omnigen. So the cows fed Omnigen at 2 p.m. and at 6 p.m. had significantly reduced respiration rates. The final one quickly for you is just the impact on the dry period on subsequent performance of cows. So to explain this, we had cows that were heat stressed, so they had no mechanical cooling and weren't fed Omnigen. Cows that had no mechanical cooling but were fed Omnigen. Cows that were cooled with mechanical cooling and then had both. Now this was the treatment during the dry period. When they calved, they were all mechanically cooled, but they all stayed on the top. But the knock-on effect of these treatments during the dry period was that the heat-stressed cows produced 35.9 kilos. When they had omnivore fed to them during the dry period, they produced 40.5. And if they were actually mechanically cooled, it was 40.7. So it was the same effect. So it's really important to feed during the dry period. And actually, this is a great product because it can be fed right the way through dry period and milking cows. No need to change anything, and well proven. So finally, just to wrap up, if you want to take a look at our website, Phibro Heat Stress Tools and Sport, you can do a heat stress calculator to find out what you could possibly be saving. You can download the respiration rate guide. You can make an appointment for a heat stress assessment from one of your Phibro representatives in your country. You can look up our references if you want to and read lots and lots of scientific papers. You can read about the EU patent, and you can even enter a competition to win a free cowler, as we call it. So thank you for your time, and I will pass you back across to Izzy.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And remember, everyone, if you've got questions for Mark, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the window, and then we'll go through them in the session at the end. I can see we've already got a few coming through, so that's great. But yeah, we'll pass over to Andrew, who's going to go into a bit more detail about how to interpret cow behaviour and how you can improve the environment.
Great, thank you, Mark. Right, is everyone seeing my screen? Oh, okay, so yeah, welcome everyone, and thank you again. I'll just reiterate Mark's thanks for your time. So yes, in the next 25 minutes, I will try and answer this one question: what are your cows telling you, building on what Mark's findings and what he's just been explaining, but also how can we help them in a practical way. So just before I start, I will just give you a bit of a background to Galebreaker. We've been established for 40 years, and a lot of people know us for the weather protection products that we started with, really. So we are designers and manufacturers of these products, but in the past 20 years, we've really been added to our weather protection, the doors and windshields that we sell and make. We've been focused on providing the best of outdoors indoors, and that's through natural ventilation products like automated side curtains, but more latterly actually into positive pressure tubes, and then also the automation of all of it so it can optimize those environments for the animals that are being housed. And today what I'm sharing with you is actually we've really been strategic in building our animal welfare team. And Izzy is one of our animal welfare analysts. But with that, we've been undertaking a number of research projects to show the value of our products as they are at the moment, but also in the continuation of development and future products going forward. And again, you'll see some of those findings today in what I'm about to share with you. So Mark has obviously quite clearly explained that there are different THI levels, and those levels can affect your cows in different ways. Firstly, with immediate signs, which you're seeing straight away, but also as those levels are, or your cows are experiencing them for longer periods, you start to have impacts and consequences, as Mark detailed. But how Galebreaker like to describe that is through some heat maps. So we regularly put loggers or temperature sensors, temperature humidity sensors on farm. And here what you can see is on the left-hand side or the left axis, you've got the hours in the day against the days, or here we're seeing from August to November last year. And you can see the coloring shows you at what level those THIs have been at for the amount for that proportion of the day. And what we can clearly see here is in the UK, we had a significant heat stress event right at the beginning of September 23, where you can, for more than 12 hours of the day, we were having THI levels of about 70 and above, but also at night, it just didn't cool off. And that, when you start to see these heat maps, you can start to see what the cows are having to experience, and then obviously linking it to the more severe heat stress and the consequences that it might entail. So answering that first question, what are your cows telling you? Now, drawing what I've just shown you in that heat map and that heat stress event, Galebreaker were undertaking a project with a UK company called SmartBell. SmartBell actually do ear tags for animals with motion sensors in. Now, the purpose of this project, which was entitled Animal Center Controlled Environment for Dairy, was actually a research project to see if the cow behavior could be used to actually be an input into a ventilation control system to optimize it, actually let the cows tell you exactly what's going on. But in doing this project, we based it at 2 commercial farms where we fitted both internal and external environmental sensors, so we knew exactly the conditions that were going on in different areas. A proportion of the cows in both farms had the ear tags, so we were able to measure cow activity, lying, standing behaviors, rumination and feeding. And then we also used CCTV and also the SmartBell app to log interventions such as foot trimming and fertility and medications. Alongside that, we've obviously got the on-farm data for milk yields that we were able to overlay. But just to show some of those findings, because actually it speaks into what we're looking at today, is actually how does cow behavior change with THI? So again, you see the heat map sitting behind, but overlaid on that, we've got the line behavior of both the first lactation cows and also the second and above lactation cows. And what we're seeing here in the line behavior, as soon as, without heat, and you can see more into the autumn months, we are getting a lying index of about 900, which is probably what we're saying is normal. As soon as the heat arrived at the beginning of September, we see a dramatic drop off of lying behavior, and therefore the cows are therefore standing in this point. The point that's really interesting is when the heat actually leaves or drops, that standing behavior, or bunching in this case, which we saw with the CCTV, is actually lasting for a good 20 days afterwards before it starts to return. And when it does return, it's the first lactation cows which are able to recover quickly, but the second lactation cows are still not having the line times that we would ultimately want. Linking that also into feed and rumination, you see exactly the same things going on as soon as the heat arrives with these animals, that the feed behavior drops. It almost drops to nothing actually as the heat event or the heat event continues. When the heat drops off, the eating behavior or the feeding behavior increases, is almost they're trying to get as much sustenance as possible to fill their gut again. But at the same time, what we're seeing is as the feed for rumination, as the feed drops off, their rumination increases to try and get as much sustenance out of the food. It drops a bit, but then when they eat again, their rumination continues and goes very high for the 20-day period again. And it is really showing this recovery period where the cow has been severely affected by the heat event, but they need to get as much sustenance out of that food as possible to recover and start performing as they wish. Linking that directly to milk yields, again, similar to what Mark was showing, on this farm with the cows that we were monitoring, so this is the curve, the milk yields for the second lactation cows and the first lactation cows that we were monitoring, there is a gradual drop-off throughout the whole test period, but that was just basically their days in milk were aging during the lactation and therefore dropping off. But what we do see with the heat event is their milk yield drops to a minimum at the end of the heat event. But again, it's what Mark was referring to, that 2 to 3 week period where they start to recover back to what they would normally trajectory would have been on. And actually in this one instance, this with the cows, we applied it to the whole herd, but we were thinking that it was showing at least around about 50 litres per cow, and over a 200 herd, that was a £2,500 loss for the farmer just because of that heat event. and it just shows the financial impact that heat stress can cause. And it's not just the milk that's being yielded during the heat event, but the recovery period afterwards. Secondly, as we looked at the farm, and it again relates to what Mark was referring to, we had 2 farms here, and actually these are the average milk yields for over the course of the lactation for the cows that we're monitoring. And okay, the farm 1 is a high yielding farm, but you can see the gradual drop off, and as they start to go under average for the lactation period. But what we start to see, or what we were assessing, is that in that day 14 to day 100 in days in milk, that is when we consider them to be in peak lactation. So their milk yields on average are above 110% of their average for the full lactation. And then also when we look across the herd, there are obviously higher yielders and lower yielders during that. And if we just take the top 20% as what we term the high yielders, when we put those 2 groups together and actually focus directly on the high yielders that are in peak lactation during that heat event, we saw the biggest drops in daily yield, and we saw the biggest drops in line time and the biggest drops in feed. So again, it just shows that there are, at a particular point in time, the more vulnerable cow are your high yielders and those that are in peak lactation. So secondly, then, how can we help them? I've just explained what happens during a heat event, but actually what can we practically do to help a cow? And to do that, Galebreaker's approach is very much looking at the ventilation of the building. Now, inside an enclosed housing or a barn or shed, as Mark put it, we have a number of cows. Now, each of those cows are producing heat and are warming the air around them. Through natural buoyancy, hot air rises. That hot air, it rises into the eaves of the building and looks to escape. And again, usually at the ridge, there are some openings that allow for exhaust. So as that hot air rises, it can draw fresh air in to replace it from the sides of the building through the inlets. Now, 2 things can affect how what we term the stack effect, how well it performs. Firstly, the stocking rate. The stocking rate, the more cows we have in that building, the hotter that air is going to become. Yes, it may rise, but dependent on how well it can exhaust and how much fresh air can replace it, you can naturally, and again, Mark referred to it, the internal temperature of the building is warmer than the outside of the building, just because of the heat that's being generated by the animals. Secondly, crosswinds. So on a windy day, buildings naturally ventilate ventilate better due to 2 phenomena really. Firstly, the crosswinds pass over the ridge, and that can actually create a suction effect, causing the hot air to escape. But also, if the crosswinds are arriving into the side openings or the openings in the building, they can naturally drive fresh air into the building, again replacing the warmer air. So natural ventilation, therefore, is improved if we can maximize the inlet and exhaust of a building. And general principles are saying that actually your inlet area needs to be 2 to 4 times the area of your exhaust to work correctly. We'll come on later in some slides that's often not the case due to some of what we're doing to the building design. But what you can quite clearly see, and I assume the audience here today is all thinking that we're all incredibly different. We've got different stocking rates, we've got different designs of buildings, so every building ventilates differently, and therefore every building can be vulnerable to heat stress to a greater or lesser degree. Some of those things, just to compare the buildings and just to give you some practical thoughts to apply to your own buildings that you might be aware of. Firstly, the side inlets then, where the fresh air can come into the building. Mark referred to it, but quite often buildings, certainly you see a lot of it in the UK, we've got multiple ridges or multiple pitches being joined. It's cheaper to build. It takes less area on farm, but unfortunately, when we've got an adjoined building, we instantly reduce that inlet area, because actually, if you look at this central building here, for that to ventilate, it's going to draw in the air from the adjoining buildings, and therefore it's not fresh air, it's pre-warmed air that's going to arrive into that central section. Now, again, some buildings are completely open on the sides, and actually in certain situations that's actually the best performing building. You've got the maximum amount of inlet in the summer months to allow that fresh air to come in. However, you start to think of it in other seasons, in the winter months, you might have driving wind or rain that suddenly makes the inside of that building or feed passageways become wet, and you need some kind of protection. Mark referred to it in Scotland, where they probably focus more on the winter months than the summer months. Then actually we've got ways that buildings are enclosed more to focus to keep those inclement weathers out. So vent cladding or space boarding is quite common. Again, great for the winter, but come the summer months, we've got reduced inlet areas on the sides of the building, and therefore aren't going to perform as well when we're trying to address ventilation for the heat or to minimize heat stress. The perfect solution that Galebreaker really focuses on is actually the automatic side curtain. So actually having curtains which can close up when they need to, based on wind and rain, or when it's colder inside the building, but then automatically opening and allowing that stack effect to be at its maximum when it needs it. So yeah, again, the side inlets can have a range of options there. Then focusing on the ridge, what options do we have there? We've got historically a lot of buildings have this ventilated crank ridge, small openings just on that ridge tiles that allows some ventilation. However, in our experience when we've carried out smoke tests, there is not much draw or exhaust happening through those openings. They're probably a sixth of what they need to be. The next option would be to open the ridge. So actually having a small ventilation gap right on the ridge section throughout the length of the building, again, allows that hot air to escape. The disbenefits that may arrive there is, again, rain entering the building, maybe into feed passageways. And again, just because of that, small openings can work okay, but as soon as you make them large to expand that exhaust, you've got an increase in the amount of rain that might enter the building. So finally, the one option that can satisfy both those things is a ventilated light ridge, which is covered over the opening, so no rain can actually fall through that opening. But due to the wind baffles on the sides, the air, as winds pass over the ridge, accelerates over the top, creating a chimney effect, and actually draws air through quite a small opening, but accelerates it through, and therefore you're maximizing your exhaust without allowing rain to penetrate that building. So I've talked about the crosswinds, and actually building orientation in respect to the prevailing wind plays a big part on how well a building can naturally ventilate. Now here we have a building which is perpendicular to the prevailing winds. The wind passes across the ridge, accelerates over the top, creates that draw, but also some of the wind passes into side openings. Again, that building is going to ventilate to the best of its ability when it's like that. Now, unfortunately, that's not always the case. And this was a decision that has happened years back, that a position of a building may not be in the direction or perpendicular to the prevailing wind. And we often see on farm that actually some buildings are aligned in the direction of the prevailing wind. Now here, the wind passing around the building behaves very differently. Firstly, it hits the ends of the building, which are often have small amounts of openings, and well, it's the shorter width of the building as opposed to the whole length. So very little air will enter the building from the end, and certainly not be able to pass all the way down the building to ventilate it. and then not all the air will pass over the ridge. It can pass around the edges, and actually, therefore, you're not creating that maximum suction on the exhaust. Again, you're going to get reduced natural ventilation in those circumstances. And then finally, Mark referred to it, looking at the direct sunlight through openings or roof lights can actually affect the animal's behavior and where they lie. Now, this is a dairy farm, not one of those that we tested with the motion sensors, but a farm that we've been working on. And actually what you see here is it's a raised roof. So it isn't a joined building, but with a raised roof. And we have an opening here, which faces to the east. Now, this was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun was actually at the south end of the building and not playing a big part. And we see that all these cubicles are being used to some degree. 2 hours earlier, where the sun was actually rising in the east and passing through this opening and directly shining on this row of cubicles, you can see the cow's preference was completely different. Now, the actual internal temperature of the building was not particularly warm. It's still in that thermoneutral zone for the animal, but that direct sunlight on the cow made them prefer to go somewhere else in the building. And actually, it is that inconsistent light which we find is actually causing cows to bunch now or stand up and move to other areas of the building. Now, even though it might not necessarily be cooler, they associate a darker light to be cooler, and therefore that's often where they might bunch. And where they've got direct sunlight, they consider it to be hotter and therefore want to move out the way. So, why mechanical ventilation? Mark referred to this, and actually natural ventilation certainly helps to a point. But we all know on a warm day, we prefer to have a desk fan going and put our face into that moving air. And that's actually because you get cooled through convection. So it's the moving air that makes you feel cooler. It takes your body heat away, warms the air up and takes it away from you. So that's exactly the same as what the cow is needing at some point. And when's it needed? It's when you haven't got, it's got inadequate natural ventilation. So the natural ventilation isn't enough. We might have a lack of crosswinds. Again, that's the benefit. So those warm, still days where natural ventilation isn't going to be prevalent, needs to have some assistance. And then there might be a degree at particularly high temperatures, you just need to cool that cow as much as possible. And therefore, that's where mechanical ventilation in our mind takes over. So there are options, and certainly Mark referred to some, but the standard fans you often see on farm can be these helicopter, high volume, low speed fans. Some have high speed directional fans that can pass along cubicles, or just panel fans over certain areas. Galebreaker, they work, they do cool the animal, but I would say there's some disadvantages in some of these approaches. Firstly, they do recirculate dirty, warm air. So it's that already where we're seeing that stack effect with these helicopter fans, we're forcing that warm air back down on the animals to try and cool them through ventilation, and we're not allowing it to escape. So these fans also, all options, move high volumes of air that actually, as you see here, could be just as much over a feed passageway than it is above the cubicles, even though it's creating that circular motion. So, and there's multiple fans in a building, which costs money to run. So it's that efficiency of that air moving around that needs to be really considered. Galebreaker do take a different approach. We look at using positive pressure tubes. So it's a tube that has a fan at the end of the building and inflates, and then is perforated along its length to deliver jets of air in a precise and controlled manner at the right airspeed to cool the animal. Now, this has some benefits. Firstly, it is fresh air coming in from outside the building. That is less humid. It's maybe a bit cooler because it's likely to be warm air outside, but it is also clean. And it is therefore, if we're bringing fresh air into the building, we're forcing dirty air out. due to how we design it, it is distributing that air directly above the cubicle as well. And every cubicle has the same air delivery. So unlike where we've got directional fans, which might hit one cow and therefore a cow further down the run could be sheltered to some degree, every single cow gets the same air delivery, and it is one fan, which is more efficient, so it is cheaper to run. Now, just to see some of these benefits, here we've got some thermal imaging cameras on farm. The top pictures are the cows lying without a vent tube cool above them. So you can see that where they're warm, certainly in the rumen area, and where they're suffering from the heat stress. The photos below, you can't see the tube, but you can see the jets of air. That is where we are precisely directing those jets of air from the vent tube cool. And you can see that we aim to hit the back of the neck and then over the rumen, where you're trying to keep their body temperature cool. Just to show some of those effects, I mentioned the ACE project, or the Animal Center Controlled Environment for Dairy project, that we carried out. We carried it out on 2 farms. One farm, which I presented earlier, those initial findings, didn't have any cooling above the second lactation cows, but also it was space boarded. You can see here, it was an adjoined building. It had a part open ridge, and there were roof lights. But you can see here that actually different cubicles had different THI values, and therefore it really explained that actually we saw cows leaving this area and bunching in this area. Only 2 THI points different, but they noticed that subtle change, and therefore that's where they wanted to congregate. The second farm, which I'll show you, was actually a farm where we've installed our vent tube cool product above every cubicle. Again, you can see here the variation above the cubicles, a lot more consistent THI values, but also the building was open-sided, it had a part open ridge, there were still some roof lights. So it had better natural ventilation, but not necessarily optimum. But again, you can see here the percentage of time the cows were still experiencing high levels of THI, but with the next few slides, you'll see the benefit of the vent tube cool. So here's the lying behavior, farm 2 with the vent tube and farm 1 without the tube here. So you can start to see that actually the lying behaviors, there's a delayed drop in lying behavior, but as soon as the heat finishes, they bounce back a lot quicker. They're lying down almost instantly after the heat dissipates. Whereas without the tube here, we saw that recovery period being a lot longer. If we look at the feed and rumination, again, there's a slower drop off in feed intake. It still did drop off during the end of that heat event. But again, as they bounce back, they do gorge and eat a lot, but their rumination doesn't need to increase as much because they don't need to have that recovery period, or the sustenance. It just goes back to their normal levels. And then finally, looking at the milk yield differences between those 2 farms, with the vent tube, we still saw some drop, but again, the milk yield was able to bounce back. There was a small subtle difference with the first lactation cows, but that was actually because of something else. Before the heat event, they actually increased their number of first lactation cows. They introduced new cows into the herd that hadn't got used to the robot and therefore were severely affected their milk production. And therefore, just to compare those 2 herds, we've got 18 litres being lost with the vent tube, but 50 litres per cow being lost without the mechanical ventilation and restricted natural ventilation on the building. So some key takeaways for people today. Firstly, step 1, always look to optimize your natural ventilation first. It has minimal running costs. It reduces your reliance on mechanical ventilation. But when you do that, consider all seasons. Just don't make sure it's the right for the winter or right for the summer. Try and consider all seasons to come up with what's best for you on farm. Secondly, consider to what degree mechanical ventilation is required. Now, Mark's shown and we've shown, we would always suggest measure your temperature and humidity index you've got a lot of data on a dairy farm already, but actually it's the THI which is missing. So actually by monitoring THI, maybe in different areas, you can understand which buildings or which zones are requiring your mechanical ventilation, and maybe where you're housing your high yielders could be another area to focus on there. But it's quite easy once we've done those heat maps, or once you've got an understanding of what THI is going on, you can then overlay your milk production, your cow health, fertility data, and lameness, and start to see those trends. And you might be able to then really understand how much mechanical ventilation you could benefit from. So then finally, looking at implementing a cost-effective mechanical ventilated option, we would always suggest to prioritize where your cows are lying. That's where you want them to spend the most of their day. So that is really where I would prioritize your look, and then to consider the costs of your running of any mechanical ventilation. Just make sure it's cost effective, and then giving you that payback and return on that investment. Secondly, or lastly, my last point, just continue to monitor cow behavior and performance, even when you've put your mechanical ventilation in or improved your natural ventilation. Just continue to monitor it, because as we've seen today, it's through that monitoring and looking at the cow behavior that they'll tell you what they require. So hopefully that covers everything from what I had to share today, but I will now hand you back to Izzy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And just a reminder to get any questions in now, and we'll be shortly answering them. But I just want to hand back over to Mark quickly to go over an exciting new project that Galebreaker and Phibro are developing, which will be coming this summer.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah, sorry, maybe overrunning a little bit, so apologies, but we'll get to the question and answer bit if you want to pop any more questions in there whilst I just show you this. So we have an exciting project between Phibro and Galebreaker that will be coming live in May 2024, and that is a website, as you can see on the screen, thi-live.com. If you make your way there, you will then be able to look at conditions across Europe. It's an interactive website which shows live THI values measured on farm. They're located on dairy farms throughout the UK and the EU, and you will be able to kind of zoom in a lot more and find a farm in your area for indicative live THI data. So it won't be the same as your farm, because obviously every shed barn is different, but it will be local conditions, the weather, hopefully close by to where you are. You can also use that website to find out your own THI, if you can measure your own temperature and humidity, and you can then find out what the potential signs and consequences might be from that as well. So you can use that as a reference guide. The sites will be available throughout the UK, Netherlands and Belgium, and we look to expand that a little bit more as we go forwards. So it will be launched in the coming month. You will get a mail to let you know. If you'd like your farm to be part of THI Live, please contact us. If you want to know any more, feel free to reach out. But this is a new project for the two businesses, and hopefully going to be able to bring more interactivity and more feedback for you, so you can understand what is going on in your country, in your region, hopefully your locality, and what the signs and consequences might be that you will be potentially able to observe on your own farms, and reaching out to either of the businesses for solutions that we can put in place. So hopefully that's of use to you, and I'll pass across to Izzy to manage the questions. Great,
thank you. Okay, so we've got quite a lot of questions actually. So we'll start with the Omnigen Phibro questions, Mark, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Firstly, what is the active in Omnigen that modulates immunity?
So basically, there's a combination of products. So you saw from the slide, there's bruised yeast and natural silicates as well. But it's a combination of these products that actually activate the immune system. So it's not one particular ingredient that does it. It's a combination of different ingredients that we'll be looking at. And I think I can just preempt another of the questions because I have seen the Q&A, but somebody was asking, do we still see benefits from Omnigen even when THI isn't high? And yes, you do, because it's not designed as a heat stress modulator. It's an immune modulator. So the benefits of improved udder health, fertility, and heat stress is almost like a bit of an add-on. So you see huge benefits in animal health. Otherwise, at any point of stress, calving, drying off, group changes, nutritional changes, as well as heat stress.
Okay. Do you know what the expected return on investment is when someone starts feeding Omnigen?
Yeah, we work on basically there's approximately a 2.5 to 1 return on investment, and that's proven across many markets, so not just the UK or European markets, but across the US and across the world as well. So approximately a 2.5 to 1 return on investment product.
And then lastly, is there a build-up time to see the effects of Omnigen, or is it an immediate?
For the full effect of Omnigen with the immune modulation, you're looking at a 6 to 8 week build-up. But for things like heat stress, you start to see the effects much earlier than that. As with any product that you would feed to address heat stress, you normally need a minimum of a 3 week build-up for the cows to then be able to see those changes, basically. So yeah, we need for full immune system change, 6 to 8 weeks. But for heat stress changes, we'd be looking at close to 3 weeks, really.
One for your conception rate graph, Mark. Don't know if we can go back to that slide.
We can if you like, and I saw the question. If you want, the question was about why did we get changes when sometimes it went, the THI was low, but we saw a drop in conception rate. And I'd like to emphasize that those were weekly THIs. So imagine your 7-day average THI, not day by day. So within a week, when you average 64 THI, there could have easily have been a couple of days of 67, maybe, and then also days that were closer to 61, because this is the UK and this was just at the start of a heat wave. So that graph is indicative of what's going on. And also we noticed that later on, sometimes the temperature was higher, but we saw good results. And again, it's because we're talking averages for a week. So you can drill down into the data, but the data is quite clear that you go from a 50% conception rate to between 15 and 20% just when THIs are rising, and that's on averages. So yeah, it's just because the graph it doesn't drill down into day by day. So that's the reason for the changes.
Okay, maybe Andrew can answer these ones. About direct sunlight, how can we reduce the effects of direct sunlight? And do clear roof panels increase the heat in the building? What can we do to resolve this?
Okay, yeah. Firstly, the direct sunlight, we've seen a number of solutions. Firstly, buildings quite regularly have roof lights, and actually things Mark referred to it as well. Roof lights, certainly on the south face, in the northern hemisphere, south facing roof is going to see direct sunlight, and you might create sun or hot spots on certain cubicles. Now we've seen farmers can just paint over them, and again reduce that direct sunlight effects. Openings, like I shared, could be solved in a different way. Just as much as you can have curtains or clip-on windshields to stop weather, you can also use it for shades. And actually, the one farm that the second farm, which had the vent tubes, was south facing with a large opening, and they've used the Galebreaker base screen, a clip-on windshield mesh fabric, to create a shade so that direct sunlight positioned a bit higher can actually stop that direct sunlight falling on certain cubicles at certain times of the day. Again, different options, different choices, and at different cost levels. If it's a particular issue, it might, and you want it to be fit and forget, an automated system could be the right choice. Other simple solutions is just a clip-on mesh panel, or paint a roof light. Yeah. With regards to the clear roof, I feel a bit, I can't speak into it precisely. We did have a THI sensor on one farm, which did have one of those new clear roofs. Firstly, I talk about consistent light levels. You do get a good consistent light level with those light roofs. However, and I can't speak if this was normal, because it could be caused by other things, but we were noticing 2 or 3 degrees higher in temperature in the pitch where there was a clear roof. I'm only speaking on one farm. I'm not saying that isn't right or wrong. It was just what I've experienced on farm with the sensing that we've seen. But I've not been on many farms with that clear roof covering. Yeah.
I was just going to add that it's very difficult to do it retrospectively, isn't it? It's quite more expensive. I've seen more barns being built with fewer roof lights and even no roof lights in some cases. But to retrospectively do it, I've seen farmers who've covered them from the inside, so to speak, but also painted them. But yeah, it's a difficult
one. Yeah, I think that's right. I think lighting is very important for fertility and just general cow health, but it's regulating it and making sure it's consistent all times of the year. We've got some questions about the vent tube cool, Andrew.
Yep.
How much energy or cost can you save using a vent tube over fans?
Yeah, okay. As I said, some fans are moving they move air at a high velocity, so they're moving a lot of air, and then they might be not precisely aiming it like we are with the tube. So the only way we can really do a comparison is, or where we have done a quick calculation, is if we took a 40-meter length of cubicles, and if you looked at some of those high velocity directional fans, they would suggest that you probably need 2 fans to cover those. Each fan will probably cover 18 meters in length and 6 meters in width. So a head-to-head, 40-meter head-to-head cubicle, probably you would need about 2 fans at a minimum to cool those cows. Now, the kilowatts of looking at the kilowatts of those fans, we're about 2.2 kilowatt energy usage per fan, and therefore it's 4.4 kilowatts. If you look at our tube, which is delivering maybe slightly slower air speeds, and I see there's a question about airspeed in there, but precisely directly onto the animal, we're not moving as much air, and therefore actually in that situation our tube is only using 560 kilowatts. It's 1/5 of the energy usage. So apply that to your cost of electricity and you'll start to see the financial impact. So yeah, do you want me to answer the question on airspeed?
Yes.
Yeah. So there was a question about what air speeds do we look to get. Now, actually, there was some research done by Wisconsin University in the States looking at actually the benefit of airspeed. Now, not to say we know the higher the airspeed, the more cooling effect you get. However, it's all about efficiency. The more air speed you are delivering, the more costly it is to run, like I've just had that example. So it's about the efficient delivery of air and where do you get your maximum benefit. Now, the research done by Wisconsin was actually showing that actually you're looking air speeds more than 2 meters a second. It costs more to above 2 meters a second, you're not going to get that full payback. So actually the optimum airspeed is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 meters a second, which is where we design our tubes to deliver. Yeah. At cow level when they're lying down. Sorry, I should say that.
Right. And what was the maximum length for the vent tube?
Yeah, again, just because of air delivery, we would say our maximum length is in that 50-meter range. So, but again, long sheds, you can just bring your air in from either end. But yeah, it's all about the diameter of the tube and the amount of air that you can deliver through one fan is where our limitations lie.
Great. And then lastly, someone wanted to know, are these vent tubes being used in holding pens, collecting yards?
Yeah, they certainly can be. We've seen it certainly in the States where some of these tubes are being used again through Wisconsin, that they were putting them above holding yards. So it has that benefit. It has the same cooling effect, and you can create that natural coverage. So we would just say that actually you do need to keep them cool in the collecting yard, but actually what we're really trying to promote to save lameness, milk production, all those fertility is where they're lying. So actually we focus initially very much on just making sure they're the right for above the cubicle, but there's absolutely no reason why we can't put it above the collecting yard.
Great. And then just a couple more, I think, to finish. We're just going to swing back to you, Mark. There's a couple more for Omnigen. What's the cost per day of feeding Omnigen? Is it a set feed rate for milkers and dry cows?
So the cost per day will vary country to country, so I can't really give an answer to that one, unfortunately, because I know we've got, depends where that question came from. In terms of the feed rate, it is a standard feed rate, 55 grams per cow per day for all mature dairy cows. So that's dry cows, milking cows. That doesn't vary. It can be fed to young stock, and we have different feed rates for that. But for adult cows, it's 55 grams per cow per day, dry and milking.
And is there a way we can measure Omnigen improving immune system in cows?
Well, we've got a whole host of research papers proving it. So measuring certain immune measures within the cow, but we also do something called an immunity challenge, where we work with our customers to track the health production of their cows over a 6-month feeding period and compare it to corresponding 6-month feeding period from the previous year or the previous 6-month feeding period, and we can compare drug usage, instance of mastitis, fertility traits, calving traits, and things like that. So we can measure it on farm. We do measure that. I'm very proactive with that as a business, so we can work with customers on that.
Great. And lastly, another question about Omnigen. In the Middle East, the THI could reach to 100. Do you think Omnigen will give the same rate, increasing conception rate and milk yield?
You're talking a different scale of heat stress there. So the benefits of Omnigen will be the benefits of Omnigen. So reducing the respiration rate compared to not feeding it, reducing internal body temperature compared to not feeding it, and that is always going to be the benefit. So that's going to always hold true, whether those levels are higher in the first place. I think what you get with all animals is you can't prevent anything. You can't prevent disease. You can't prevent heat stress, but you can reduce the impact of it, and that's really what Omnigen can do. So it will mean that animals would be less impacted basically by it. But to give you a measure, you're probably better to speak to a local Phibro representative than myself, sitting in an overcast Shropshire.
Great. And then just a couple more for Andrew, and then we'll finish up. What's the difference in investment for a vent tube against 2 fans? Have we done any work to show this?
Yeah. Again, I can't really talk into that. I know basically all I would say, and I would say that I'm quite confident for my advice to a farmer would be go and get your quotes, but not just look at the purchase price of your products. Consider the full running costs. And again, it goes right into that analysis that on farm you should be able to see a return on that investment. And actually so I can't speak into that today to give you exact figures, because it'd be wrong for me to say either. But all I would say is I have confidence that actually look at your return on investment but consider running costs as well as capital purchase.
Great. And then just one for the ear tag project. What's the next steps for the ear tag project, or where is it going to lead?
Yeah, as I said, it's an out there project, but we had some really good findings from that initial thing, that actually cow behavior can be used as an input into a control system. And actually my Galebreaker and SmartBall are looking to do that next proof of concept to actually get something on farm and working. So yeah, just watch this space, but yeah, it's certainly in progress.
Cool. I think we've run over a little bit, so I think if there's any other questions, we can answer them on the chat, or we can get back to you by email. But yeah, thank you very much everyone for joining. I think it's been a really informative webinar. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.